February 1981. Paris wears its winter uniform. Wet streets, breath turned to smoke, a gray sky that can't decide whether it is morning or afternoon. In a small apartment not far from a metro line, a man leans over a briefcase on a kitchen table scarred by years of plates. He is not a spy in the way movies prefer. His suit is government issue. His hair is neat in the way office hair is neat. He has the kind of face you would forget if he passed you on the stairs. But his hands, those are different. His fingers move like a draftsman's, precise, unhurried. He is laying documents in order, not because paper likes order, but because the people he will meet tonight need to believe, down to the staples, that he is a man who does not improvise with lives. NHE has a name, of course. He has two, in fact. One belongs to the country that trained him to keep secrets and honor the emblem on its buildings. The other is a name someone else will write on a file in blue ink, farewell. It will be chosen by men who enjoy words almost as much as they enjoy caution. The word sounds like a toast. It is, in reality, a fuse. NHE checks the pages again. Lists, diagrams, memos printed in fonts that don't believe in drama, names that sit next to telephone numbers the way a fuse sits next to a match. He knows what he is carrying. He has worked for years in rooms where technology is cataloged like treasure and targeted like prey. He understands which laboratories matter, which factories matter more, and which engineers will become targets because they are too clever to notice that cleverness paints a target on a back. NHE opens the door and breathes the weather, the way a man does when he is leaving the apartment as himself and returning as someone else's problem. On the street, he walks like a person who has always lived in a city, flexible, watchful, never hurried unless a bus insists. He has learned to see reflections in windows meant to sell dresses. He has learned the faces of people who stand still without having good reasons to. He has learned that most danger looks bored before it looks dangerous. NTHE meeting place tonight is insultingly ordinary. A car park near an office block, whose architecture believes office blocks should look like filing cabinets turned on their sides. He arrives early with the courtesy of a man who understands that punctuality is a kind of mercy. The other car arrives on time with the indifference of professionals. Two men step out, one younger, one whose coat tells you he has since learned to trust tailors. Their smile lines are small. Their eyes do not dilute their questions with friendliness. He opens the briefcase on the back seat, as if they are parents deciding whether to buy something for a child. Paper changes hands. No one claps. And because this is Paris, because even gravity is elegant in this city, the exchange is framed by the Parisian version of banality. A scooter whining, a dog making decisions about a lamppost, a couple performing the negotiation between anger and kindness in a whisper. The moment looks like nothing. It is not nothing. NHE returns home lighter by the weight of paper and heavier by the weight of consequence. The briefcase is just a briefcase again. He places it on a chair as if it is tired. He stands at a window and watches his neighborhood do its evening rituals. Lamps blink on. Curtains close. Radios murmur. He is not interested in drama. He is interested in schedules. Schedules keep people alive. Days later, another meeting, this time in a park that has known both monarchs and teenagers. He sits on a bench with the posture of a man who has taught himself not to take up more space than a bench requires. His new friends, if that is the word you use when you are talking about professionals who keep their first names in their pockets, sit down without making a scene of it. They have brought a question you cannot write in a memo without making God laugh. Why? He answers carefully because truth has to fit into sentences, and sentences have to fit into plans. He tells them he has spent years inside a system designed to catch up by stealing. Not the crude stealing of bags at airports, but the polite theft of ideas disguised as trade. The long seduction of technology from offices that assume visitors are benign because visitors look like them. He has read the shopping lists written in steel and obsession, software that makes machines behave like angels, chips that teach missiles to be clever, turbines that let ships outrun promises, control systems that turn oil and gas into obedient energy. He has watched committees with names that sound like weather plan how to acquire things faster than the other side can invent them. NHE tells them he is done being useful to that. He does not say the word betrayal. He does not have to. The men on the bench already understand that loyalty is a geometry problem. Where you stand decides what you think is straight. They test him, of course, not by asking whether he believes in their flag more than his own, by asking him to draw the map he carries in his head. How does the apparatus work? Which department writes the letters that become invitations? Which attachés at which embassies are not attachés at all? Where is a decision truly made? Where does morality lose its patience and become appetite? He answers with the calm of a man who has delivered briefings to people who correct him when he mispronounces acronyms. He does not perform. He inventories. A week later, they meet again. And again. The cover for these meetings is rarely more complex than normal life. A walk past shops that sell meat and newspapers. A conversation that looks like two colleagues discussing a report they dislike. A pause. In the dappled shade of a tree planted when cities still believed trees could solve city problems, to exchange a small package for a smaller question. He doesn't mind the banality. Banality is armor. The extraordinary attracts attention. The ordinary pays the rent and leaves you alone. This is the work in its purest form. A willing source with a short reach and a long memory, and a team whose discipline is so complete it looks like grace. A handler who knows that silence can be a tool sharper than a threat. A typist who will copy a document with the exact pressure a photocopier would have used when the world was less serious. A radio operator who can be trusted not to let adrenaline turn a signal into a confession. A courier who believes feet are as good as engines if you give them enough minutes. NTHE file they are building begins to look like a city of paper. Street after street of names, addresses, phone numbers, technical requests dressed as cultural exchange, visiting schedules that are not curiosity but reconnaissance. The lists are terrible in their beauty. You can see the appetite of a superpower laid out like a feast plan. Everything is here. Fiber optic manufacturing methods, semiconductor doping secrets, control software lexicons, the math that teaches a missile to discriminate between sky and lie. The file is not a scandal, it is a map, and maps are how you stop getting lost. At night he returns to the rooms where he is expected to be loyal. He goes to work like any man. He answers questions as he was trained to answer them, with a tone that has been ironed flat. He writes reports designed to be skimmed by men who believe skimming is the same as reading. He makes sure the coffee in the break room convinces no one to linger. He knows exactly which chair to sit in when a meeting accidentally becomes important. He is a professional in a building that rewards appearing to be a professional. He will not be caught by drama. If he is caught, it will be by boredom or by luck, and he has decided to give both as few chances as possible. His French handlers, men who love their city with a ferocity that is gentle and implacable, bring the file to people who wake up every day inside the problem he has described. There is a room in Paris where a general will hold a page like it is both fragile and dangerous. There is a room in Washington where a secretary will read the same page and forget to sip his coffee. There is a building in Ottawa where a careful woman will overlay the names with a map of her own and find lines she had suspected but not proven. There is a basement in London where a sentence in a memo will make a man scratch his head and then smile the way people smile when a puzzle suddenly agrees to be simple. Because of the file, something begins to happen that rarely happens in a world that feeds on suspicion. Allies synchronize without insisting on being congratulated for it. Lists are pruned. Invitations are declined with exquisite politeness. A certain kind of official who has spent years being invited to conferences for the pleasure of collecting lanyards finds his calendar suspiciously empty. Attachés change cities so fast their furniture loses the will to be furniture. A network that had always believed it could replace heads faster than you could count them discovers that necks matter too. And then there is the other thing, the one that will sit in the biographies and be disputed over glasses of good wine by people who were not there, but have read enough to sound as if they were. The thing is simple to describe and complicated to prove. The deliberate gift of poison fruit. If you know what your adversary wants to steal, you can make the theft hurt. You can see diagrams with errors that are faithful to the laws of logic, but unfaithful to the laws of stress. You can season software with a pause, exactly long enough to feel like a glitch, and short enough to pass acceptance tests. You can shape the subtle in such a way that it waits patient, inside a system until a Tuesday in a winter 3 years from now, when pressure changes and a state-of-the-art machine decides to behave like the past. That, at least, is one version of the story that men will tell later with confidence that exceeds the available paper. Our narrator offers you caution. What is certain is that a file made stealing harder. What is plausible is that it also made stealing dangerous. NHE is asked if he is afraid. He answers with the dignity of a man who has paid attention to fear and found it useful rather than sovereign. He is not reckless. He is not suicidal. He is angry in the measured way that produces results, not at a country or a flag or a people, but at a machinery that eats the dignity of thought and asks to be thanked for the meal. He prefers a world in which engineers invent for their families and their futures, not for a payroll at a building with too many doors. There are days when the work is merely work. He goes to a park and no one sits on his bench. He takes the long way home because the short way feels like a statement. He buys bread, and the baker says something about the weather that men say to men when the weather is an alibi. He stands at a tram stop and watches ads pretend they know what people want. He rechecks his calendar and finds it is still loyal. These days are gifts. They are also traps. On quiet days, people feel invulnerable. He prefers to feel precise. One evening, a change. A face he has seen once before appears twice in a week. The second time is a Tuesday, and Tuesdays are rarely interesting unless they decide to become interesting on purpose. The face belongs to a man who pretends to fix his cufflink when certain people pass him on a stair. Our man makes a note with the interior part of his brain that keeps notes without ink. He leaves a cafe by a door he does not usually use. He lets the street walk him until the street is sure he is no longer a question. He sends a micro signal with the absolute calm of a man picking lint off a sleeve. The signal is received by a team that believes the opposite of panic is not courage but choreography. Within an hour, the bench is a different bench. The briefcase is a different briefcase. The route is a different route, and, more importantly, it is more boring than the original NTHE file grows fat. The fat is not vanity, it is evidence. There are pages that list entire programs by their nicknames, the way children list the names of their friends with pride. There are rosters of officers and embassies from Tokyo to Bonn, men and women who attend the right receptions and take home the wrong conversations. There are requests written by departments in cities that do not enjoy saying please and yet somehow do, requesting machines they cannot afford, software they cannot invent, and the dreams of scientists who like to talk because talking proves they exist. He has given his new friends not one network but 1,000 points of leverage, and then, always then, the moral question arrives with its good clothes on. What are we going to do with this? Are we going to prune? Are we going to poison? Are we going to stand up in public and shout? Or are we going to whisper in private and let quiet remove the oxygen from the fire? The argument does not break along the lines you expect. Hard men argue for patience because they have learned what happens when you make the other side bleed for show. Soft men argue for noise because they have learned what happens when bureaucracies are spared embarrassment. In the end, the decision is the decision democracies usually make when they are at their best. Do the thing that serves the citizens, not the newspaper. Make it harder for the theft to work. Make it less fashionable to be stolen from. Save the speeches for funerals. NHE continues to meet. The briefcase continues to be briefly the most important object in Paris. The file begins to change lives. Quietly first, then noisily. In European capitals, gates open, and the first wave of diplomats discover that their welcome has expired. tickets are booked without smiles. The rides to the airport are civil and very fast. A few are surprised, most are not. They have always known that the only thing less permanent than cover is furniture. They are replaced, of course. But the replacements arrive to a different climate. The climate is skepticism, wearing a friendly face. NWE returned to the man at the center of this, the one who chose a briefcase over the calming weight of silence. He is not a saint. He has made mistakes. He will make one profound mistake later, one that will matter to him and to the country that trained him. But right now, in this winter that refuses to end, he is doing something that most of us can only write about. He is making a complicated place slightly less dishonest. He will not be famous for it for years. He does not care. He understands better than most that fame is the tax you pay when your luck runs out. NHE meets his handler, always the same man when the situation allows, because changing faces creates noise. They walk along a canal that performs water for apartments that like to believe Paris still belongs to poets. The handler asks about safety, about health, about appetite, because hungry men make mistakes, and then about schedules, because schedules are where safety and hunger shake hands. He asks, finally, the question that good handlers ask: anything unexpected? The answer is boring. The answer is perfect. Known at a desk in a capital across an ocean, a policymaker reads the latest digest. The words are dry, the consequences are not. Here is a catalog of theft so comprehensive it offends even people who have learned not to be offended by reality. Here is a network described down to the kind of paper it prefers. Here are vulnerabilities dressed as shopping lists. The policymaker closes the file and looks at a map on the wall. The map is not of the world, it is of relationships. He puts a finger on a line that, thanks to tonight's reading, will be cut, and another finger on a line that will be rerouted, and he says to no one in particular, "We'll do this quietly." You do not sabotage a superpower with a headline. You do it with 1,000 small corrosions applied precisely, a visa withdrawn, a committee that never meets, a shipment delayed until its buyer loses interest, a lecturer who discovers that the audience has been advised to ask questions they will later forget, a customs officer who checks a box he usually does not check, a program manager who retires and is replaced by someone who does not owe favors to the same men. A checklist updated, a gate closed. A fuse that never finds a match because the room where the matches are kept has been redecorated and no one thought to tell the fuse. NHE closes the apartment door very softly when he returns from a handoff. He sits on the edge of his bed and looks at an alarm clock that has stopped pretending its face is cheerful. He does not sleep immediately. He has chosen his work. He has chosen his reasons. He is choosing tonight to trust a machinery he cannot control. He understands that trust is not emotion. Trust for him is a checklist that passes inspection. He breathes. In a different time zone, engineers at a company that has never been invited to any embassy reception add an extra question to a questionnaire they send to foreign buyers. It is the kind of question that would be harmless if the buyer were a buyer and explosive if the buyer were a ministry. In another country, a colonel decides to recommend always-on chaperones for visitors from certain countries, not to humiliate them, but to save them from their own appetites. In yet another place, a security officer at a lab receives a phone call canceling a tour that had been on the calendar for months. No explanation. The day remains blessedly dull. He goes home early and does his taxes. This is how empires are defended. Not with drums, but with paperwork that refuses to be stupid. NTHE Briefcase sits in a closet behind a winter coat that smells like clean wool. It will be needed again soon. When it is, it will be ready. The man who carries it will be ready too. He will turn a key, open the case, lay out the pages, and decide that the paper is again exactly straight. He will exit his apartment with the unobtrusive grace of a person who knows gravity personally. He will blend into a city that is very good at hiding the important among the picturesque. And he will walk toward another exchange that looks like nothing at all and refuses to be nothing. There is a night coming when someone will make a mistake. Not him at first. Someone else. A man will speak too loudly about a friend. A schedule will be changed and then changed back and then asked about. A meeting will be moved from one perk to another, and a young face will be noticed too many times by a doorman nobody taught to stop noticing. The weather will conspire by being too beautiful. A name will appear in a place where names are not supposed to appear. The machine that prides itself on being thorough will remember how to be thorough, and then everything will become fast. NBUT, not tonight. Tonight, the city closes its eyes. Somewhere, a safe opens. Somewhere else, one closes. On a desk in Paris sits a file thick enough to make a table lean, and inside that file is the blueprint of an appetite, and on top of that blueprint sits a single sheet of paper with a single word handwritten at the top in tidy, confident letters. Farewell. And that is where we pause. Paris asleep, the briefcase waiting, the fuse burning so slowly it looks like a thread, before we step over the line where a map drawn in pencil begins to redraw the roots of power. Spring arrives like a rumor. Paris turns its collar down. The man with the briefcase keeps his up. The file fattens. The handlers stop looking amazed and start looking busy. The first consequence appears not as thunder, but as paper. A quiet note from Paris to Washington. From a president who liked ideas to a president who liked decisions. Here is what we have, the French say. Here is how big it is. Here is what it means. NTHE response crosses the ocean with more caution than speed. Meetings bloom like late flowers in secure rooms, the kind where the staplers are always in the same drawer, and the coffee tastes like a secret you don't quite need. The page spreads out on table after table. Lists of officers routed through embassies, procurement requests disguised as friendship, front companies that sell nothing but appetite. Men with stars on shoulders place paperweights on corners that try to curl. Civilians who do not enjoy uniforms lean in anyway. No one argues about whether the material is significant. They argue about how quiet to be. In Ottawa, a woman who arranges other people's caution takes a red pencil to a travel schedule and eliminates 3 cities. In Bonn, a list of science counselors is read with the skepticism of a country whose history does not allow it to pretend. In London, a man whose job title would ruin a dinner party calls another man and says only, "Yes, it's real." In Washington, a director who likes leverage more than speeches smiles without showing teeth. He has been handed the rarest commodity in his business, clarity. Clarity leads to pruning. It begins in Europe, where diplomats who are not really diplomats feel the ground tilt under their shoes. A wave of polite shock travels from chancery to canteen, expulsions, dozens in some capitals, scores across the map. Bags are packed with the practiced dignity of people who knew this day would come and hoped to be assigned elsewhere before it did. Covers collapse like card tables. Phones go still. Apartments are reassigned. The network troubled the air for years. Now it troubles airline schedules. And still the briefcase opens and closes. The man with 2 names maintains his schedule. He does not dramatize. He meets, he hands over, he walks home via streets that will never remember he was there. He remains a mid-level official inside a machine that believes loyalty is a geometry you do not question. He continues to fill his days with minutes that look like everyone else's. He is unremarkable on purpose. France, having opened the door, keeps a hand on the hinge. The service, the one that keeps Paris safe by refusing to be photographed, plays host to a cooperation that is as rare as it is practical. They bring the Americans into the circle, yes, but they also insist on leading the waltz. The source is theirs, they say. His safety is theirs. The rhythm of meetings is theirs. The Americans agree, not because they are generous, but because they are serious. You do not argue choreography when the dancer knows the floorboards by name. NTHE counterintelligence picture changes shape. Before, it was fog with shapes in it. Now lines go crisp. You can draw the path of a request from a directorate in Moscow that speaks in euphemisms to a committee that approves with rubber in its stamp, to an embassy that translates appetite into invitations, to a conference where a cheerful photo will be taken that later will look like evidence. You can also draw the return path, from a professor's pride to a prototype's crate, to a front company in a country that sells flags by the week, to a lab in a city that prefers snow, to a factory where a machine will be built from the future and handed to the past. NSO the West does two things, sometimes at once. It closes doors, and, according to later accounts, it spikes a few open doors with gifts that smile. Some versions of this story will say a piece of software with a handshake problem found its way into a pipeline system, and years later produced an explosion with a size you could see from space. Other versions will say the tale has been cleaned up for storytelling, that the reality was less cinematic and more clever. Subtle malfunction, slowed production, machines that wore out faster than math predicted. Our narrator recommends humility. What is solid is this: once you know what is targeted, you can control what is acquired. Once you can control it, you can decide whether the theft subtracts, adds, or explodes. The file gave that choice to people who had been living without it. Meanwhile, the man with the briefcase continues being a man who owns a briefcase. He eats at the same cafes because changing restaurants is how you announce that you have something to protect. He buys the same bread because bakers remember the indifferent. He stands at the same tram stop, checking his watch with the same small impatience as every other commuter who believes clocks are conspirators. His handler occasionally lets a joke into the conversation like sunlight into a basement. Humor is not a luxury. It is an anti-seizure medication. And then comes the Tuesday when the world begins to lean. NTHE first tremor is not visible from a distance. A man who should not be curious becomes curious. A floor warden decides that a procedure he has skipped for months should be unskipped. A file appears on a desk it does not belong to and lingers there long enough to be admired. None of these things matter alone. Together they start to spell a name. NTHE service picks up a noise in the wire. The Americans, briefed with the calm of surgeons, remove their hands from any lever that could snap. The meetings compress, then develop gaps in them where minutes used to live. The briefcase stays home a week, then two. The man with two names notices nothing at first because noticing is a luxury you don't allow yourself if you mean to stay alive. He finally notices. He doesn't change anything. That is its own kind of discipline. Across town, a different drama begins to write itself. A private life decides, in the way private lives do, to flip a table. An argument turns ugly. A knife appears. A woman is hurt. A stranger is hurt worse. The police arrive to deal with the ugly part of life that doesn't require a counterintelligence file. They are competent in the way hard cities train competence. They arrest a man and carry him away from a scene that smells like bleach and noise. NHE goes into a cell. He is charged with violence, not espionage. But violence invites inventory. Inventory invites curiosity. Curiosity demands paperwork. Paperwork is the highway that takes a case from a precinct, where men smoke to a directorate where men do not. A name enters a database. A light blinks. Somewhere, a clerk who does not know words like strategic types a note in the margin of a file, and a machine that believes in patterns opens an old drawer. NTHE service learns late. They are told, not asked. They discover that their man is in the custody of the very institution he has been draining, drop by drop. Silence follows, the heavy kind that allows no oxygen between sentences. Then haste follows, polite on the phone and absolute on the ground. Lawyers appear like umbrellas. Requests are made with the urgency of friends at a hospital. They are told to wait. They do not like that word. Interrogations begin under lights that are never warm. He denies nothing because there is nothing yet to deny. He is a suspect in a violent crime, and there is an established path for such suspects. The path leads to a trial in which small lives are judged with the seriousness small lives deserve. But the name, that name, vibrates in a different register. A second team arrives with different questions. They do not begin with the night of the knife. They begin with a season of benches. He understands immediately that the wrong part of his life has been found. He rearranges his posture into something that will carry him for as long as it must. NTHE service tries to pull him into the shade. The shade retracts. He is not their citizen. They have loved him professionally, and they have promised nothing beyond craft. They ask for consular courtesies, for humane treatment, for a fairness that does not wear quotation marks. They get some of it. They do not get him. NTHE Americans are told gently, and then firmly, that their meetings have ended. They nod. They write letters that do not travel through the mail. They move on to the Act 2, that files always require, exploitation without replenishment. The file itself remains priceless, but the faucet has been turned off. What remains are the networks demolished, the export regimes hardened, the meetings canceled, the lines rerouted, the curiosity cooled by consequences. A machine that had grown accustomed to stealing oxygen is now breathing through a straw. NHE is tried for the crime in the apartment and for the larger crime against his oath. The latter trial is not a public one. Sentences are read in rooms that have never hosted a camera. There is a verdict that surprises no one who understands how systems protect themselves. Years after the last handoff in a park, long after the last page joined the file, he is taken to a place whose geography is not a matter of public record. The state that trained him to keep secrets keeps the last one. He is executed. The date will be printed later. The method will be guessed at. The certainty will sit like a stone. And now we widen the lens, because the story does not end where his life does. The file he built continues traveling, not in briefcases now, but in binders and training slides. Export controls, once a polite suggestion with loopholes, learn to use the word no. A multinational committee whose meetings used to be the world's most boring lunches tightens its lists until some technologies must wait years for permission to cross a border. Western companies discover that a sale that would have been easy is now a maze, on purpose. University labs learn a grown-up skill, hospitality that does not bleed. The default setting in dozens of institutions shifts by 2 clicks toward skepticism when the phone rings with an accent and a request that is too charming. Inside Moscow, the effect is harder to see but easier to feel. A directorate that prided itself on reach discovers how small hands can be. Collection stumbles. Front companies suffer mysterious accidents of timing. The accelerants that had kept Soviet technical programs hot enough to compete burn cooler. Engineers are still brilliant. They always were. But brilliance must now build more of the ladder from scratch. In a competition where years matter, that is a cost you cannot invoice, but cannot ignore. About the pipeline story, we remain careful. Some officials will later talk about a sabotage that turned code into shrapnel and sky into fire. Others, scholars, engineers, and people allergic to legend, will argue the timeline and propose alternative causes for whatever was seen. Your narrator offers you this. The file made it possible to inject uncertainty into the heart of a program that had relied on certainty stolen whole. Whether the explosion was cinematic or the failures were slow and silent, the effect was real. Trust in the stolen became a liability. That alone is a victory. What of the Allies? The French, who had protected a source with professional pride and proper ferocity, conduct their own accounting. They were first. They paid the risk at retail. They were also right. The Americans, who prefer their heroes to speak in English, learned to say merci with sincerity. The Canadians, the British, the Germans, the Japanese, each adjusts a dial, redraws a visitor policy, rewires a relationship with a university or a company or an embassy. It is not glamorous work. It is the long, boring defense of the future. And the man, the one we called farewell because the service that kept him alive for a time needed a word that would fit on a tab, he is mourned quietly in a city that does not perform grief for cameras. A couple of toasts are made with serious eyes, then glasses are set down with deliberate care. His handler walks a familiar canal and stops, once, at a railing he had leaned on better days. He looks at water that continues to behave like water. He thinks about a bench and a file, and a man who had the courage to be ordinary while changing something enormous. He goes home and puts a page, just one, into a drawer. He does not label the page, he knows what it is. And years pass. The file becomes history. Students read about it and argue over adjectives. Some call it a masterclass in counterintelligence. Some call it a lucky windfall. Some call it a myth burnished by men who like their stories to fit in lecture halls. The truth sits between, content to be a little dull, a middle-ranking officer with access and conscience, a service that handled him well, allies who used the gift without boasting, networks dismantled, doors shut, and perhaps, some poisoned fruit. It is not a movie, it is better. It is how large things are bent by small levers applied with patience. NWE close where we began. A table? A briefcase? Pages placed carefully until the stack itself looks calm. The man who built that stack is gone. The stack is not. The stack became meetings, and meetings became policies, and policies became a kind of armor that does not gleam. In a world that loves to tell you that only force matters, a file proved that attention, discipline, and timing can sabotage an empire's appetite without firing a shot. There is, in the archive of a service that does not advertise itself, a folder whose edges are softened by use. On the tab, a word. The word is not dramatic. It is generous and grave and true to the moment when a man walked out of one life and into another. Farewell. Here is the ending that suits a story like this. Not an explosion. Not a parade. Not a statue. A quiet line in a quiet room written in a hand that knows how to spell gratitude without saying it out loud. NT, thank you for the ordinary. Thank you for the map. Thank you for the time you bought. And somewhere, if you believe in symmetry, the city where it started turns on its lamps, and the briefcase that once carried a superpower's secret diet sits behind a winter coat, empty and retired, while the world it helped bend continues to turn, slower than some wanted, safer than most realized, under a sky that does not care who did the right thing, only that someone did. This is the file's real legacy. The idea that you can fight theft with memory, appetite with patience, and a sprawling... That is how roots of power are redrawn, by hands that answer to pencils instead of pistols, schedules instead of speeches, and a single decision made again and again. Meet, hand over, walk away, until history has no choice but to admit what happened. Farewell.